Okay, for the main item tonight, we have a debate. Is the Bible true? Is the question being debated? And with us, we have two main speakers tonight, both of whom are from right here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So I will introduce them now. We have Adam Lloyd Johnson. He is a Christian who will be arguing in the affirmative that the Bible is true. And then we have Luke Pitts, who is a skeptic, who will be arguing in the negative that the Bible is not true. So because tonight is a debate format, it will be slightly more formal and structured than some of the previous weeks have been. I'm going to give you an idea of how that's going to go tonight. So we are going to have 4 moderated exchanges between Adam and Luke, and those will last a total of 90 minutes combined. So the formal debate portion of the night will last 90 minutes. After those 90 minutes are up, we will go to a question and answer period. That'll start roughly around 9:15, 9:20, and we'll take questions till 10. So while the debate is going on, of course, everybody will be muted who's in the Zoom meeting, but that doesn't mean you cannot ask questions. So if a question comes up sometime during the debate, just feel free to put it in the Zoom chat box if you're on Zoom, or on Facebook, place it in the comments, or on YouTube, also place it in those live stream comments. We'll be monitoring all 3 of those threads to collect those questions, and we will save them till the end of the debate, and then we'll ask them to our speakers. One important note about that is that we will do kind of a back and forth structure with the questions as well. So you will want to indicate who is going to answer your question. Now, both speakers will get an opportunity to respond to your question, but we have to direct the question at somebody for the first response, and then we'll have a response to their response. So when you ask a question, it would help us if you would say question for Luke or question for Adam, depending on who you want us to ask first. Okay, a couple more things. For those of you who are here in Zoom, you can keep your video on, but like I said, we will have your microphone muted just to prevent any kind of side feedback or background noise, to prevent anything like that. So I think that is everything on the laundry list of announcements. So like I said, if you're just joining us, welcome. This is a debate, and we will be starting right about now. Adam Johnson, you will be first, and you will begin now.
Well, I'm very thankful for this opportunity to discuss this important issue. And I'm also thankful to Luke Pitts. I'm going to be referring to him as Pitts throughout this, so I don't get him confused with the gospel writer Luke. So I'm thankful for Pitts for his kindness and respect in the conversations we've had about this topic. And I wanted to say from the beginning here that I don't think of Pitts as my opponent, but as my friend. And as we know, friends often disagree, sometimes on even major topics. But this sort of format gives us a chance to defend our respective positions calmly and rationally. Well, this debate is about whether or not the Bible is true. And it's important to distinguish between 2 senses of true. So let's start with this. Imagine that we had 8 written accounts of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. 6 by people who were there in the theater that night, and 2 by people who interviewed eyewitnesses that were there. Well, in this hypothetical example, let's say that some of the accounts were written very soon afterwards, and some were written a few decades later. Let's also say that these 8 accounts agreed on the major events. That is, Lincoln was shot, it happened inside of a theater, John Wilkes Booth was the shooter, the major events they agree upon. However, suppose the accounts disagreed on some minor issues, let's say, minor details. How many shots were fired, what Booth was wearing, exactly what time it occurred, which direction Booth fled, who was near Lincoln when he was shot, etc. We'd expect such minor mistakes because of maybe human forgetfulness, right? We often remember things incorrectly. They're not lying in this hypothetical example. They've just made some mistakes because of their maybe poor memories. However, though they contain minor differences, let's say hypothetically that they all agree on the major events of the night. So we'd say that they're true in the sense that in general, they're historically reliable about the major events of that night. So this is the first sense of true I want to consider. And this level of truth, or this sense of truth, would hold up, let's say, in a court of law, for example, if they put Booth on trial. Let's suppose instead, in this hypothetical example, that somehow these 8 accounts of Lincoln's assassination got every detail correct. They made no mistakes whatsoever. That'd be unlikely, right, given the weaknesses of human memory. But let's say they accomplished this remarkable feat and their accounts had no errors whatsoever. I don't know, maybe God supernaturally guided them somehow from making any mistakes. I mean, if God exists, it seems reasonable that he could do something like that. Well, this is the second sense of true I want to consider tonight. So we'd say they're true in the sense that they're completely correct in all details. So I hope you've tracked with me. We've got 2 senses of being true here. The first one, an account could be true in that it's historically reliable about the major events it describes, even though it contains some mistakes about the minor details. Second, an account could be true in the sense that it's completely correct in every detail. So now that we have these 2 senses of true in mind, consider the Bible. So really there'd be 3 positions here, right? First, some would say that the Bible isn't true in either sense. That's Pitt's position. Second, some would claim that the Bible is true and that it's historically reliable about the major events, but it's not completely correct in all details. Some Christians would hold to this position, such as C.S. Lewis. Third, many Christians claim the Bible is true in both senses, that it's historically reliable about the major events and it's completely correct in all details. And this is my position. And tonight I'll be arguing that the Bible is true in both senses. When I argue that the Bible is true in the first sense, that it's historically reliable about the major events, these are the things that I consider to be the major events. First, that Jesus was a real person in history who claimed to be God. Second, Jesus and his disciples said they had messages from God, mostly about how people can fix their broken relationship with God. And then third, Jesus and his disciples did miracles as evidence that they really did have messages from God. The key message, or the key miracle, of course, being Jesus's resurrection. Now, if these major events actually happened, then Christianity is true in a nutshell. God exists, Jesus is God, and people can fix their broken relationship with God by trusting in Jesus as their Savior. In other words, the basic truth of Christianity only depends on the Bible being true in this first sense. So let's say I'm wrong about the Bible being true in the second sense, that it's completely correct in all details. Well, this doesn't affect whether basic Christianity is true or not. Basic Christianity is true or correct, even if the Bible does have some mistakes in these minor details, as long as it's historically reliable about these major events. So tonight I'm going to present 2 arguments. First, I'm going to argue that the Bible is true in the first sense, that it's historically reliable about the major events. Then I'm going to give you an argument that the Bible is true in the second sense, that it's completely correct in all details. So let's start with the first one. Since my time's limited tonight, I'm going to focus just on the New Testament, which contains the major events I described anyway. So there's 2 questions to address concerning the historical reliability of the New Testament. The first one is, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? The second question is, did the New Testament authors tell the truth? As you probably know, we don't have the original New Testament. All we have are copies. And these various copies do contain copying mistakes. They're called textual variants. This isn't a secret. When somebody learns Greek, maybe at seminary, to study the New Testament in its original language, the Greek New Testament actually points out where these variants are. Now, if this is new information to you, it may sound alarming at first, but the good news is that we have thousands of these New Testament copies, over 24,000 now, some dating back to the 2nd century, not to mention all the ancient books that quote the New Testament. The other good news is that while these copies do have mistakes in them, copying mistakes, the copyists made their mistakes in different places. So, for example, simple example, if one of these copies said that Peter denied Jesus 4 times, but the other 23,999 copies said that he denied Jesus 3 times, well, then it's fairly obvious that the one who said 4 times made a mistake and the original New Testament said 3 times. It's never that simple, obviously, but you get the idea. And that's where it's helpful. We have professional scholars that compare all these copies and attempt to try to recreate the original New Testament. This isn't unique to the Bible. All ancient documents have to be recreated this way. However, the more copies of an ancient document we have, the easier it is to compare where the copying mistakes, and the closer we're able to get back to the original. So, to what degree of accuracy can we recreate, in particular, the original New Testament? Well, for this, I'm going to quote a New Testament scholar by the name of Bruce Metzger. He's one of the leading scholars in this field. He was a professor at Princeton for 46 years and is one of the most respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century. So, consider this simple comparison. We have 643 copies of Homer's Iliad, a very popular book in the ancient world. But just like our New Testament copies, these copies of the Iliad contain various copying mistakes. According to Metzger, because the mistakes are in different places, we can recreate the original Iliad with a very high degree of accuracy, 95%, according to Metzger. Well, how does this compare to the New Testament, another ancient document? Well, because we have over 24,000 copies of the New Testament, we can recreate the original New Testament again, according to Metzger, with a remarkable degree of accuracy. According to Metzger, 99.5%. And the 0.5% we're unsure of doesn't really affect any major Christian beliefs. They're mostly spelling differences, a lot of times between names, spelling names differently. Now, some people might reject Metzger's scholarship because he was a Christian, which seems unfair considering his academic credentials. But regardless, consider another well-known New Testament scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist. Now, Ehrman got his PhD under Metzger at Princeton and has a great deal of respect for Metzger. I'm going to show you a quote here from Ehrman. Look what he wrote about his professor that he studied under, Bruce Metzger. Ehrman wrote, "Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in it. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. Even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he's a firmly committed Christian and I'm not. We're in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions." His quote continues, "If he, Metzger, and I, Ehrman, were put in a room and asked to hammer out what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for does not really stand at odds with Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants." So yes, the first question, we do have an accurate copy of the New Testament. The second question is probably more important though. Why should we think that the New Testament authors told the truth? So I'm going to present 6 reasons to believe the New Testament authors told the truth. First, we should believe they told the truth because they made their claims very soon after the events took place. This is important because myths and legends, they take time to develop, time for the eyewitnesses to die off. So let's just consider Jesus' resurrection, the most important miracle, right? Imagine if the early Christians didn't claim that Jesus rose from the dead until 40, 50 years after he died. Well, if that were the case, then the claim would definitely be more suspect, right? Most likely a myth that slowly developed over time. However, if they claimed Jesus' resurrection soon after his death, then all things equal, it's more likely they were telling the truth. It doesn't guarantee they're telling the truth, but it's more likely true if they made their claims earlier rather than later. So, how soon after the cross did the early Christians, including the New Testament writers, claim Jesus rose from the dead? Based on ancient creeds that date back even earlier than when the New Testament was written, we know that Christians were claiming Jesus rose from the dead very, very soon after he died. Gary Habermas lists 41 things that these pre-New Testament creeds tell us about Jesus. Consider this quote from atheist historian Gerd Ludemann. He wrote, "From historical analysis, these creeds and such, we know the disciples were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection no later than 2 years after the cross. So because they made this claim soon after the event, as opposed to decades later, this leans in favor of them telling the truth. Second, we should believe the New Testament authors told the truth because their accounts include a whole lot of accurate historical facts. Now, this greatly increases their historical reliability. Imagine the opposite. Imagine someone who claimed to be a witness, maybe to a crime, a murder or something, but they couldn't tell you anything about the context, what the weather was like that day, who was there, even the murder weapon. Well, their testimony would not be very credible if they didn't know those sort of details. Alternatively, if they were correct about such details, then we'd be more likely to believe they really were there and were telling the truth. So take the book of Acts in the New Testament. It's a prime example because it gives a historical narrative of the lives of the early Christians shortly after Jesus died. Historian Colin Hemmer listed over 80 accurate historical facts just in the book of Acts alone that would be very difficult for someone to know unless they were there themselves. For example, the names of obscure rulers, their official titles, precise geography, travel routes used at the time, even unusual cultural practices, customs, slang words from the various regions that they traveled to have been confirmed as accurate from other ancient historical sources. This has led scholars such as Sherwin White, who wrote, "For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted." So establishing the historical credibility of Acts in this case is important because, as we know, the same person who wrote Acts also wrote the Gospel of Luke. Well, third, we should believe the New Testament authors told the truth because their basic account, their basic story, is affirmed by non-Christian historical sources. Consider, I'm just going to give you two examples. Consider the following ancient writers who corroborate much of what the New Testament authors wrote. The first one here is Tacitus. Now, Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian, lived from 56 to 117 AD. And he wrote that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, who we know reigned during that time, at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. Now, this wasn't a Christian. He looked at this very negatively. Another example, Josephus. He was a Jewish court historian for the Emperor Vespasian. He wrote this: "At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah. Concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Now there's 10 such ancient non-Christian sources. And from these 10 sources alone, these ancient non-Christian sources, we have a broad outline of the major events of Jesus's life. In fact, here's what we know about Jesus from just these 10 non-Christian sources. Take a look at these. First, we know that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. We know that he lived a virtuous life. He was thought to be a wonder worker. He had a brother named James, was acclaimed to be the Messiah. These people, these non-Christian writers don't believe that, but they record that other people did. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We saw that. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their beliefs. Christianity spread very rapidly as far as Rome. And 12, his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. That's pretty much the major details of the New Testament. Now consider there's only 9 non-Christian sources that mention Tiberius Caesar. So there's a sense in which there's more historical evidence for Jesus than there is for Caesar. Now, fourth, we should believe the New Testament authors told the truth because they tell the same basic story with only minor reconcilable differences. Now, this is what we'd expect if different eyewitnesses were describing the same event from their own perspectives. Large differences between them would cause us to question their truthfulness. Also, if there were absolutely no differences in their descriptions, then we'd wonder if they got together and colluded to tell the same made-up story. But instead, what we see is the same basic events in their accounts, but with small reconcilable differences. These are the important criteria lawyers and detectives look for in determining the truthfulness when multiple eyewitnesses give an account. Now, fifth, we should believe the New Testament authors told the truth because they and others were transformed from cowards hiding from the authorities immediately after the crucifixion into courageous leaders boldly proclaiming Jesus as God just a short time later. Even some who were previously skeptics, including Jesus's brother James and the fiercely anti-Christian leader Paul, became devoted Christians shortly after Jesus's death. Now, what could have caused these radical transformations? According to them, it was seeing Jesus's resurrected body with their own eyes. And it's hard to think of another explanation that would cause such radical transformations. So lastly, and I'll be done here in just a moment, the sixth reason we should believe the New Testament authors told the truth is that they suffered tremendously for their beliefs, many of them being tortured to death. Now, many people die for their beliefs, like suicide bombers. So being willing to die for your beliefs doesn't prove your beliefs are true, but it does prove that you think your beliefs are true. So if the New Testament writers were lying, they wouldn't have been willing to die because no one gives their life for something they know is false. Those that say Jesus' disciples were lying have to explain why they were willing to die for a lie. They had nothing to gain by making this stuff up. It wasn't like America is today, where you could get rich and famous by creating your own religion. For them, all it brought was suffering, rejection, persecution, torture, and death. So this sort of historical analysis has led virtually all scholars to affirm the following facts. And I'm not going to read through them. I'll let you glance through them. But again, all New Testament scholars, because of this sort of stuff that we went through, affirm these 9 facts. Now, New Testament scholar Gary Habermas compiled a list of 3,000 scholars writing in the last 50 years, Jewish, Christian, and atheist scholars that affirm these facts. The question is, what best explains these facts? And I'm convinced the most compelling answer is that Jesus literally did rise again from the grave, providing strong evidence that Christianity is true. Now, I've only argued here for my first contention tonight that the Bible is true in the sense that it's historically reliable about the major events. In my next speech, I'm going to argue that the Bible is completely true in all details.
Okay, thank you, Adam. We will now enter a transition. So I will ask Luke Pitts to share his screen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hey, all you cats and kittens out there in cyber. I am Luke, and
Okay, Adam, could you stop sharing? Okay, we should be good to go. Okay, and go ahead, Luke Pitts, to offer your opening statement.
Okay, yeah, huge honor to get to do this, to think critically with a heavyweight like Adam. And Ratio Christi is obviously a really cool organization for doing something like this. So show up every Wednesday, come and have these types of discussions. It's a lot of fun. I was really just looking for an argument all over town, and I happened across their sign that says, does God exist? Sorry, and I thought, hey, here's somebody who's religiously obligated to debate me, so it really worked out. I used to be a Christian. I used to believe that the world was divided between two types of people. There are those who worship themselves, their things, their short-sighted human desires. They turn their back on the one that paid the ultimate price for them to be free of their sin. And there were those that accepted Jesus into their hearts, humbly submitting their lives to him and allowing him to form them into the person that they were designed to be. At some point, I realized that among the 4,200 religions that are supposedly said to exist, I'd really biased myself on one of them. And so being raised in the Bible Belt, my friends, family, community, all hail from this one religion. And my first hearing of ancient stories, ancient wisdom, my first spiritual experiences were all cast in Christianity. And so I decided to challenge my views, and I did this by taking the best argument I could find from the apologist and the best argument from the skeptic to see what makes sense to me. Ultimately, Christianity is a religion of belief, and I went forward on the assumption that if God made me and he made the Bible, he wouldn't make it unnecessarily difficult to believe. So we should take a moment to mention, the great thing about America and also Ratio Christi is that they're religiously tolerant institutions. We should be grateful that we were able to have a public debate like this. Unlike the ancient Israelites, the Christians of the Inquisition, and modern day ISIS, we get to question our religious assumptions, and I think Adam and I both think one would be well served by doing so. So just to jump into this, here's a purely hypothetical question. In the midst of those 4,200 religions, would you join one of them solely based on its claim that 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean, a religious teacher died and his followers believed that he appeared to them after his death? Okay, I hope not, because I could be talking about anybody. I could be talking specifically about Apollonius of Tyana. I could probably be talking about many more. And this is what we get from the pre-Pauline Creed and Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, that followers of Jesus within a few years after his death believed that he had appeared to them. Adam alluded to this creed and his first reason why we should believe the New Testament writers were telling the truth. The creed is a fascinating look into the history of the beginnings of a belief that changed the world. But on its own, I think we agree it's not enough to become a Christian on. And we have reason to be cautious here because 2,000 years ago, most people took it as a given that humans could become divine entities, that divine entities could become humans. It was true for our pagans. It was also true for monotheistic Jews. Just like people of ancient times, we need more. We need to know who Jesus was, what he preached, how he died, in what nature did he appear to his followers, and in what nature was he considered divine. So luckily, we have much more. Scholars identify at least 30 independent sources that can tell us about the historical Jesus, with our best sources being the Bible's Gospels. However, the Gospels are not without problems. Our earliest stories found in our Gospels were passed down orally in Aramaic. before being written down by second generation Christians in Greek. This was 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. They do not claim to be eyewitnesses to his death and resurrection. And so the very reason the pre-Pauline Creed in First Corinthians is so important to scholars is because our Gospels, along with many other writings before, during, and after the events narrated in the New Testament, contain to some degree non-historical material. Coming just a few days after Jesus' death, the pre-Pauline Creed isn't old enough to be corrupted by the legends or embellishments that appear to have arose around Jesus. Most New Testament scholars believe the Gospels to some extent contain these non-historical elements. Bruce Metzger, distinguished Christian New Testament scholar that Adam mentioned, believes so. Bart Ehrman says it's a view held by virtually every scholar, by every professor of biblical studies who teaches at every major liberal arts college or university in North America. Take your pick: Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, University of Chicago, University of Kansas, University of Nebraska. So if there's anything Bart is correct on, it's that University of Kansas, my alma mater, and University of Nebraska are in the same category as Yale and Harvard. That's a joke. And it's actually a view held by many everyday Christians. I'm sure you know some of them, and maybe you are one of them. So make no mistake, the story of Jesus is not simply a legend. Nearly all scholars believe there are historical truths or bones in our Gospels. The pre-Pauline Creed helps establish some of those bones. And Adam mentioned 9 such facts about Jesus that virtually all scholars agree. And we can actually probably comfortably go much further to know with relative certainty even much more about Jesus. The tools Adam mentioned can give us confidence in separating the true history from the legends. And this is what biblical scholarship since the Enlightenment has been all about. So let's try our hand at deciphering true history from legend. It's a pop quiz. It's called Did This Happen? And it's a yes or no quiz. It's rapid fire. And just like a real quiz, you get absolutely no context. So our first question: did David kill Goliath? Okay, yes or no? This is from 1 Samuel. Was Goliath 9'6" or 6'9"? It actually depends on which version of 1 Samuel 17:4 you read. Scholars favor the shorter version. Okay, did Elhanan kill Goliath? Thought we already went over this. This is 2 Samuel. The NIV translation says it's actually a copyist error, and Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. So the English Standard Version says that Elhanan killed Goliath. Okay, did Yahweh kill 70,000 people in a plague to punish David for taking a census for which Yahweh himself moved David to take? This is in Samuel from the 500s BC. Did Yahweh kill 70,000 people in a plague to punish David for taking a census for which Satan moved David to take? It's about 100 years later in Chronicles. Did God demonstrate the guilt or innocence of an accused person by whether or not they survived being thrown in a river? This is the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi from 1754 BC. Did God demonstrate the guilt or innocence of a woman accused of adultery by whether or not she miscarried after drinking a potion containing holy water, dust from a temple floor, and ink from words of a written curse? This is from Numbers. And these two methods of knowing God's judgment, they're known by, they're called trial by ordeal, and they're very common throughout the ancient world. Did God demonstrate the guilt or innocence of a person based on the roll of these dice? These are divination tools, Urim and Thummim in Samuel. Did God say, if a man betroth a girl to his son, but his son has not known her, and if he then defile her, he shall pay her half a gold mina and compensate her for all that she brought out of her father's house? She may marry the man of her heart. This is the Code of Hammurabi again. Did God say, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her for as long as he lives. This is Deuteronomy. Some apologists say the NIV translation of rape here is wrong, and that's okay. Just wanted to show that we have Deuteronomy about 1,000 years later here. Did this wisdom come from God? The high priest must not marry, for a prostitute can be had for a loaf of bread, but another man's wife preys on your very life. This is in Proverbs. Did this wisdom come from God? The high priest must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, but only a virgin from his own people, so that he will not defile his offspring. This is from Leviticus. Was it ever true that one could be blessed by bashing a baby against a rock? This is, of course, Psalms 137. Did God say, do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves? I am Yahweh your God. Sounds about right. This is Leviticus. Did God say, make a snake and put it up on a pole? Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. And this was, of course, after the Israelites had been bitten by deadly snakes, for which God sent to punish them for complaining. Did King Hezekiah break into pieces the bronze snake God told Moses to make because the Israelites were burning incense to it? This is in Kings. Did God kill the seven-headed sea serpent Lotan? Baal-Hadad in the clay tablets of Ugarit. Did God crush the heads of the sea serpent Leviathan and give them to the people in the wilderness as food? So Psalms. Did God flood the earth to punish its inhabitants for their wickedness while sparing a single righteous man, his family, and 2 of all the earth's animals by telling the man to build a large ark? This is the Babylonian Astrahasis epic. Extant, that means the thing that we can actually touch comes from 1620 BC, pictured here, and also Genesis extant 150 BC. Did the Most High fix the boundaries of the people according to the number of divine beings? And Yahweh's portion was Jacob. This is from Deuteronomy. This is a Dead Sea Scrolls variant. And so you may have read where throughout the Old Testament we see Yahweh is my portion. From this verse, we know what that means. Yahweh is their portion of the divine beings. Did God ask for advice from other divine beings before allowing one of them to go down to earth to be a lying spirit in the mouth of a human? This is in Kings. Christian scholar Dr. Michael Heiser says, if it sounds like a pantheon, it's because it is. Did the sons of God come to earth to have sex with women who gave birth to semi-divine giants? This is in Genesis and Numbers. Were these giants 450 feet tall? This is the book of Enoch, which we forget is the 3rd most common book found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Was the first king of Rome born of a virgin, and did he ascend to heaven and reappear alive to Proculus Julius to the amazement of the Romans? This is written about 10 to 30 years before Jesus' birth. As a child, did Jesus heal his brother after he was bitten by a snake? This is the infancy gospel of Thomas. Did someone heal themselves by touching Jesus' robe? And the only reason Jesus knew was because he felt the power shoot out of him. This is throughout our synoptic gospels. Did Jesus ride into Jerusalem straddling 2 donkeys, one smaller than the other? This is only found in Matthew. Matthew seems to have misinterpreted the prophecy in Zechariah. The other gospels have him on just the one colt. Did Jesus say, let him who is without sin cast the first stone? This is from John. However, Bruce Metzger says it's a later addition. He says the evidence for the non-Johannine origin is overwhelming. Did Jesus say, and these signs will accompany those who believe? In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well. This is Mark 16 through 18. Nearly all scholars agree that Mark 16, 9 through 20, though, is a later addition. The original Mark ends with trembling and bewildered. The women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Did Peter make a smoked tuna swim again? This is the Acts of Peter. Were some Christians killed by the Holy Spirit after selling their land and only giving a portion of the money to the church rather than all of it? This is in Acts. Did Paul say women should remain silent in the churches? If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands. If they want to, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. This is 1 Corinthians. A majority of scholars believe it's a later edition, but it's kind of a debate. Were there letters forged in Paul's name in circulation in Paul's lifetime? According to 2 Thessalonians, yes. Which coincidentally, scholars are split on whether itself is a forgery. Note that nearly all scholars agree that 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are forgeries. Did Judas actually not kill himself, as in Matthew and Acts, but live on, bloated so much in the flesh that he could not go through where a chariot passes easily? Indeed, not even his swollen head by itself, his whole body flowing pus and worms. And when he had come to his end, the place became deserted and uninhabited until now from the stench. But not even to this day can anyone go by that place unless they pinch their nostrils with their hands. So great did the outflow of his body spread out upon the earth. This is Papias, 65 to 90 years after Jesus' death. Did televangelist Benny Hinn, through the power of the Holy Spirit, raise a Ghana man from the dead in front of 500,000 people? This is according to Benny Hinn. That's our source there. Did Indian guru Sathya Sai Baba perform signs of his divinity, such as materializations of small objects, to the amazement of thousands of his believers? We have photographic proof right there of him doing it. This is on YouTube. He did this for a number of years. Okay, so if you believe that any of these claims did not actually happen, and I hope that you do, ask yourself, why do you think the author came to record a false story? Okay, did they purposely invent them to gain power or prestige? Did they mistakenly think they had supernatural inspiration when they didn't? Did they just misinterpret what they saw? Were they possessed by Beelzebub? Were they joking? This is an actual apologist claim for one of our Bible stories. Let you try to guess which one. Or did they faithfully record the stories they were told, but the stories had been embellished over time? What about inventing a story to fill a theological hole or to answer a critic of their day? Or did they purposely invent the story to tell what they believed was a deeper truth or a metaphorical truth, like Washington chopping down a cherry tree? It didn't actually happen, but the writer thought that it exemplified Washington's honesty, which is what he was known for. If I could guess, I would say one or more of these could be good reasons for any one of our pops quiz stories. But I think despite how our storytellers or their sources came to report these stories, they actually have a single underlying motivation that shouldn't be ignored. And it's a motivation we share with them, a desire for hope. A hope that we can make sense of the mysteries of the universe, that we can correct the world's injustices, that we can bring back loved ones from the dead, and that we can save us from our own deaths. It's a motivation many through time have felt is well worth suffering for. Thank you, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Luke. We will now go into a transition. So first, we will have Adam share your screen. So we've reached the end of our first round of back and forth. That was 20 minutes apiece for those of you watching. And now we're going to move into our second round. It'll be slightly shorter. We'll have 12 minutes apiece. The second round will again begin with Adam in response. Now let's see, Luke, stop sharing your screen at this time. Looks like we have transitioned screens. So Adam, you are good to go.
All right. Well, I'm thankful that Pitts has raised so many important issues that should be fully evaluated. Obviously, I'm unable to address all of them in my allotted 12 minutes. Thankfully, though, Christians have thought through these issues carefully, and their responses are available for us to consider and think through. Before I respond to some of Pitt's objections, let me first give you my argument that the Bible is completely true in all details. So remember, there's two senses in which the Bible could be true. First, it could be historically reliable about just the major events, but contains some minor errors. Pitts mentioned, for instance, that most New Testament scholars, believe the Gospels contain, to some extent, some non-historical elements. And that's correct. Most scholars believe that. While there are many scholars who, like me, believe the Gospels are completely correct in all details, there are more scholars who believe that the Gospels are historically reliable in general about the major events they describe, but contain some minor historical errors. As Pitts mentioned, Bruce Metzger is one of them. It'd be similar, as I see it, it'd be similar as though I had a friend who told me about a car accident she was in, but she mistakenly said that the car that hit her was black when in fact it was dark blue. Now, I wouldn't reject the major event in her story, the car accident, as false just because she made a mistake about the color of the car, a minor detail. And that's how many Christians like Metzger understand the Bible, including C.S. Lewis, that it's historically reliable about the major events, but it does contain some of these minor errors. Other Christians, though, like myself, believe the Bible is true in the second sense as well, that it's completely correct in all details. This would be like my friend who got in the car accident when she told me about it, getting every single detail correct. Now, these two positions about the Bible being true require different types of arguments, of course. The first sense of being true, being historically reliable about the major events, that requires an inductive argument based on empirical evidence that these things really did happen in history. And I presented that evidence in my first speech. The second position, though, that the Bible is completely correct in all details, can't be argued for inductively for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's statements in the Bible that can't be verified empirically. For example, there's some statements about things that took place so long ago that it's impossible to verify historically one way or the other. Plus, secondly, there's statements about the spiritual world, obviously in the Bible, that we can't verify empirically. So the second position about the Bible being true requires more of a deductive argument. And I'm going to lay out that deductive argument for you now. So here, the first premise, there's good historical evidence that these major events happened. And I've gone through these before. I won't read them, but you can glance through them here. So the first premise in this argument that the Bible is completely true begins with the previous sense of being true, that it's historically reliable about these major events. So it rests on the first argument, but builds on it with the following premises. So premise two, there's good historical evidence that Jesus and his disciples said that the books in the Old and New Testament were messages from God. Premise three, when God gives a message, being a perfect being, as most theists understand him, he can only tell the truth and can't make any mistakes. Therefore, deductively, we would conclude that the Old and New Testament are completely true in all details. Now, consider if what would happen in my belief system if I became convinced that there is, in fact, an error in the Bible. Well, if it was a major error, like Jesus wasn't really resurrected, then I'd reject Christianity. But if it was a minor error, I'd conclude that the Bible, or one of the authors made a mistake, or I'm sorry, that I made a mistake somewhere here in my deductive argument. And I'd adopt a position like C.S. Lewis or Bruce Metzger that the Bible is true in the sense it's historically reliable concerning the major events, but it does contain some minor errors, like my friend telling me about her car accident. Now, for Pitt's objections, I was really encouraged at first when he said that we should try to decipher true history from legend, because I completely agree. But then instead of presenting any historical evidence, he gave us a whole list of things, some from the Bible, some not, and he asked us if we thought these things happened. So here I'm going to respond to some of the things that he mentioned in that list. Now, first, he mentioned some things from the Bible that seem at first audacious, incredible, or just really strange. But it's unclear what he's implying by this. Maybe that these things are just so strange that they can't be true. If this is what he's implying, then this is a terrible way to decipher true history from false history. Should we dismiss something as false just because it strikes us at first as unusual? Let's say I've got another friend and they claim to make 7 hole-in-one shots on the golf course yesterday. Now, that'd be very unusual, but just because it's unusual, would that be a good reason to automatically reject it as false? I'd probably be very skeptical of his claim, but I shouldn't reject it just because it's unusual. Instead, I should evaluate the evidence for it. Did anybody else see you hit these 7 hole-in-ones? Was it videotaped by chance? So it's evidence, not strangeness, is the best way to decipher true history from false history. Second, some things that Pitts mentioned from the Bible are similar to other ancient stories. For example, Noah and the Ark is similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's unclear what Pitts is implying by this. Maybe that a historical claim can't be true if it's similar to another story? Well, if that's what he's implying, that's a terrible way to decipher true history from false history. Consider this. There was a gentleman, Morgan Robertson, who wrote a story about a British ocean liner that was approximately 800 feet long, weighed over 60,000 tons, could carry 3,000 passengers. And he wrote this story about this ship hitting an iceberg on its maiden voyage in the month of April, ripping up an opening in the forward part of the ship, and then sinking along with about 2,000 passengers. And that ship's name was spelled Titan. And that's it, the Titan. Now, while this story is eerily similar to the Titanic, this fictional story about this ship called the Titan, Robertson wrote that fictional story in a book, The Wreck of the Titan, which was published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, and several years before construction of the Titanic was even begun. So should we conclude the historical account of the Titanic sinking is false because it's similar to an older fictional story? No. Evidence, not similarity or dissimilarity to other stories. Evidence is the way to decipher true history from false history. Number 3, Pitts asked us to consider possible motives that would lead the biblical authors to lie. He suggested several different possible motivations, mostly evil ones. And he said, if I could guess, I'd say one or more of these could be good reasons. But that's just it. He's merely guessing. It's very difficult to know somebody else's motives unless they specifically tell you. And even then, it's extremely difficult for people to know their own motives most of the time. Regardless, it's unclear what Pitts is implying here. Do we decipher true history from false based on somebody's motives or our guesses about their motives? His main guess is that they were motivated by hope. But even if that's true, is that a good reason to conclude they were lying? That seems a stretch. What if a scientist, for example, claimed to have discovered the cure for a disease, a cancer maybe, that her daughter happened to have? Clearly, the scientist is motivated by hope, But should we assume she's lying then, just because she's motivated by hope? No, instead, we should evaluate the evidence as to whether the cure works or not. It's evidence, not guessing at motivations, is how we decipher true history from false. Fourth, Pitt said that Christianity is just one of over 4,000 different religions, implying that it's unlikely people who were raised in a Christian culture just happen to believe in the one that's true. But this is a terrible way for deciding or for deciphering truth from falsehood. Consider that there have been thousands of different beliefs among various cultures about the sun. Some cultures believed it was a god. Some believed it was a giant monster chasing the moon around every day. Now, I've been raised in a culture that believes the sun is mostly hydrogen and helium, right? A giant nuclear furnace. Should I doubt this belief? Because of all the beliefs about the sun, it's unlikely that I just happen to live in the culture that believes what's true about the sun. No, that's a terrible way to discern truth from falsehood. Instead, what I should do is look at the evidence for the belief I've been taught and evidence for other beliefs about the sun. Then make my decision on what to believe based on the evidence. Fifth, Pitts asked if you would join a religion solely based on the claim that 2,000 years ago, a religious teacher died and his followers believed he appeared to them after his death. I wouldn't. But that's not an accurate description of Christianity, at least not my Christian beliefs. I don't believe Christianity is true based on the claims it makes, but based on the evidence for those claims. Also, I don't believe Christianity is true solely based on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, though the compelling evidence for Jesus' resurrection plays a large part in why I believe Christianity is true. It's not the sole reason. There's several other well-evidenced reasons that have led me to conclude Christianity is true. Six, and I'll be done in just a second here. I want to challenge Pitt's statement that all scholars agree that 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are forgeries. D.A. Carson is a New Testament scholar, for example, who got his PhD from Cambridge, and he argues, again, based on the evidence, that Paul did in fact write them. And even if the majority of scholars think they're forgeries, which I doubt, what's more important than which position has the majority? What's more important is the evidence which leads the scholars to their respective positions. Now, I know we can't all become New Testament scholars, but we can and should spend some time evaluating the evidence for both sides. I've done this, for example, for these 3 books, and I don't find the evidence that they're forgeries very convincing. In fact, I found the evidence they were written by Paul, presented by Carson and other New Testament scholars, to be much more compelling. But again, don't take my word for it. Evaluate the evidence for yourself.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Now I will go through a transition to Luke Pitts's response. So first, Luke, share your screen. All right, appears that you have. Now, Adam, stop sharing your screen. All right, and we have reached the transition. Luke, your response.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Wikipedia, it's a great way to start a speech, right? Defines astrology as a pseudoscience that claims to divine information about human affairs and terrestrial events by studying the movement and relative positions of celestial objects. Why is this relevant? Because when Jesus came to Earth, he used the ancient pseudoscience of astrology to signal to the world that he had arrived. The magicians or magi that practice ancient astrology were some of the first to know. They saw his star. Their false practice paid off in this case. So what I'm getting at is, do we judge miracle claims differently by whether or not they are in the Bible? There are plenty of miracle claims to judge in the birth narratives of Jesus, and so that's what I wanted to dive into. And Adam said that we have to look at the evidence, and so that's what I want to do, is look into some evidence in detail here. So Christian apologist Frank Turek, along with the majority of New Testament scholars, believe the Gospel of Mark was written first. One reason is because Matthew and Luke seem to have had a copy of the Gospel of Mark when they wrote their accounts. One of the stories Matthew and Luke did not get from Mark are the birth stories of Jesus, and that's because Mark doesn't have one. In fact, Mark tells us that Jesus' family thought he was crazy. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said he is out of his mind. Um, did his family forget about the miraculous circumstances of his birth? So put yourself in the shoes of a first generation Christian who's trying to evangelize to the Jews of the time, as the first Christians wanted to do. And all you have is the Gospel of Mark, because Matthew and Luke hadn't been written yet. You are going to get pummeled on one very important point by the Jews that you preach to. Okay, they're going to say, don't you know what the prophets said? Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. Just like King David, the ruler is to come from Bethlehem. Jesus was from Nazareth. They called him the Nazarene. Nazareth is 65 miles north of Jerusalem. Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem. Sounds like you got the wrong guy. So coincidentally, 15 to 35 years after Mark was written, we get the story of Jesus' birth. Actually, two of them, one in Matthew and one in Luke. And these accounts were written 80 to 110 years after Jesus' birth. And surprisingly, they overlap on actually very few points. His mother, Mary, gave birth to him as a virgin. His father's name was Joseph. And you could probably guess this last one. Although he was from Nazareth and never himself spoke of being from anywhere else, he was actually born in Bethlehem. And strikingly, the stories of how that last point came to be are use two different explanations. So we're going to go through those. Luke's story of the travels of the Holy Family is fairly short. They start from their home in Nazareth, and they are forced by a worldwide Roman census to travel to Bethlehem because Joseph belonged to the house and line of David. Jesus is born. They travel back up to Jerusalem to have baby Jesus consecrated in the temple within 40 days of his birth in accordance with the law of Moses. And then when Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. So for Luke, the reason Jesus was said to have come from Nazareth, but was actually born in Bethlehem, is because when his family, who lived in Nazareth, took a quick trip to Bethlehem, he happened to be born. Okay. Matthew's story begins after Jesus was born, and the Holy Family is living in a house in Bethlehem. The Magi see Jesus' star and have followed it to where it stops above the house where Jesus is. King Herod's chief priests remind him about the prophecy in Micah 5:2 that we just discussed. And then Herod gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Very important to remember. Fortunately, Joseph had already been warned in a dream to flee to Egypt. This would be a very long trip through the desert. After some time, Herod dies. Joseph is told in another dream that he can return to Israel. And this is probably where you'd be expecting Joseph to return to the place where in Luke's narrative, we know the Holy Family is from, right? He's going to go back to Nazareth, but he doesn't. He wants to go back to Judea, which is where Bethlehem is. It's not where Nazareth is. And he actually has to be warned in a second dream to go to Nazareth. And this is the first time that Nazareth is mentioned in the Gospel of in Matthew. First time it's mentioned in Matthew. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So in Matthew, they start in Bethlehem and they land in Nazareth as refugees. That's how Jesus is from Nazareth, but actually born in Bethlehem. So one thing you probably are trying to do in your mind, how do we combine these stories into one single coherent harmonization? One difficult problem that comes up is, where are we going to put Matthew's visit of the Magi into Luke's account? Okay, church fathers Eusebius and Epiphanius thought the Magi visit came later, like years later after Jesus' birth. This is because of the time Herod had learned from the Magi. The problem with this placement is that the Holy Family ends up in a house in Bethlehem after being back in Nazareth at the end of Luke's narrative. That's a trip not in either story, and it means there were actually two separate trips to Bethlehem, each with miraculous visitations. Trying to avoid this conflict, church tradition has the Magi visiting just a few days later, and that's what this slide is that I went to too quickly. That's why they're in the nativity scene. But then the problem is what Eusebius thought. Why did Herod have all the children under 2 killed based on the time he heard from the Magi if Jesus was just a few days old? That would also mean that when Luke says that they returned to Nazareth after doing everything required of them of the law in Jerusalem, they actually didn't. They went to Egypt. However, both harmonizations struggle here. They both assume Matthew's account happens after Luke's account. But Matthew's account ends by saying, having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. The end of Matthew's story has the Holy Family fleeing to Nazareth for the first time. Coincidentally, historians also have a lot of issues with these stories. For one, there is no record of the Romans ever requiring people to return to their ancestral home from 1,000 years ago for their censuses, as Joseph was required to do because he belonged to the house and line of David. How would anyone know where to go? How could they all get there? Why does Joseph have to go 42 generations back and not 20? Also, what purpose does that serve for a census whose purpose is to tax you for your possessions? Presumably, Joseph didn't have possessions in Bethlehem. Some apologists have pointed to an ancient document of Egyptian census from 100 years later, but it only speaks of migrant workers returning to their home to be counted, which makes sense, not people leaving their home to go to the home of their ancient ancestors. An additional problem is Jesus is born during the reign of Herod the Great. We know Herod died in 4 BC. However, in Luke's story, Jesus is also born when Quirinius was governor of Syria, but that didn't occur until 6 AD, according to Roman sources and the ancient historian Adam thinks we should trust, Josephus. Lastly, on the historical side, Matthew and Luke both provide genealogies, and they both agree on Joseph being the first generation back, okay? But then they disagree on almost every generation before Joseph. One apologist argument is that Luke is giving us Mary's genealogy. If so, that would be possibly the first recorded case in ancient Judaism of tracking genealogy through the mother. Also, given that they both start with Joseph, don't you think Luke would have let us know that he was talking about Jesus's mother's genealogy rather than his father's? Some apologists have said that the appearance of a prostitute in Matthew's account means he wasn't making up. That's what Frank Turek said when he was here. However, lowly people coming up big is a central theme in the New Testament. So because of these issues, a vast majority of scholars, including many Christian scholars, have concluded that the narratives of Jesus' birth are not to be understood as actual history. The stories appear to be invented for theological reasons many years after the events they describe, and they were invented to help spread Christianity. And it's a big problem. Matthew and Luke are our earliest sources of the accounts of how Jesus appeared to people after his death. So even though invented, we'd be wrong to presume that the birth stories have no value. They certainly give us enormous insight into the history of the early Christian world, and they stand as some of the most enduring and hopeful stories ever told. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luke. So at this time, we have come to kind of the halfway point. So thanks for sticking with us. We can all take a deep breath. We are halfway through the debate. We now have two more moderated exchanges left. At this time, I will direct Adam to start sharing his screen. While that is happening, as a reminder, you can submit questions for either of our two speakers tonight. Please indicate who you want to submit the question for, but both will get a chance to answer each question. Questions can be submitted through Zoom. You can chat with me in the Zoom chat. My name's Joel, or you can leave comments on both our Facebook live stream and our YouTube live stream if you want to ask questions. So we invite you to do that. And I think if Luke can stop sharing. So now we will move into speeches that are both 8 minutes long, and we will start, there's the timer. We will start with Adam with the third round of responses. Adam, you have the floor.
All right, thanks, guys. Well, Pitts claimed that the Gospels contain errors, obviously. That was his argument, but I'm going to push back respectfully and argue that these were not errors. So the first one here, the wise men were not astrologists. Consider the star traveled ahead of them and stopped over Bethlehem, according to the New Testament. So it's pretty obvious from that description that this wasn't a literal star billions of miles away, right? The Greek word in the original New Testament written in Greek, the Greek word was astera, and that's translated as star in our English Bibles. But this Greek word was used in the first century really for any light in the sky, including sometimes angels. So we can conclude from this, God didn't use a literal star to guide them, but some sort of supernatural light within Earth's atmosphere. Second, the Gospels say that Jesus's family thought he was crazy, yes, but they don't say that everyone in Jesus's family thought he was crazy. So we can assume that Mary didn't think he was crazy, only his siblings. And we know this from history, that his brother James didn't believe he really was the Messiah until after his resurrection. Third, and this one's going to take a little bit more time, there's at least 3 plausible explanations for why Matthew and Luke's genealogies of Jesus are a bit different. So the first one, it's plausible that Matthew, as Luke mentioned, or as Pitts mentioned, it's plausible that Matthew gave Joseph's genealogy, whereas Luke, the gospel writer Luke, gave Mary's. And yes, it's true, tracking someone's genealogy through the mother was rare at the time, but it would make sense that Luke would do this if he believed Mary had conceived Jesus as a virgin, and thus Joseph wasn't his biological parent. In that case, it would be important to track Jesus' lineage through Mary, his only true biological parent. That it was rare to track someone's genealogy through the mother might even explain why Luke didn't mention Mary in the genealogy, but just instead used Joseph as the son-in-law, if you will, of Eli. Many of Luke's readers in the first century certainly knew who Joseph and Mary's fathers were, so there really wasn't a need to mention Mary. The second plausible explanation is that Matthew's genealogy is through Joseph's father, whereas Luke's genealogy is through Joseph's mother. Now, we know that both genealogies have gaps, and that was a common practice in recording genealogies. For example, when it says that Joseph is the son of Eli, this doesn't necessarily mean Joseph is his literal son. It could mean that Joseph was his grandson, great-grandson, or even more steps back. Third, it's plausible that Matthew's genealogy is through Joseph's biological father, Jacob, where Luke's genealogy is through Joseph's legal father, Eli. Now, this was a situation that happened in Judaism under levirate marriage, where a woman whose husband had died before they had any kids would marry her deceased husband's brother. And then their first child would be legally registered as the son of her first deceased husband. And Sextus Julius Africanus, in a letter to Aristides from the 3rd century, explains it was known that Joseph came from one of these levirate type marriages. And if so, then they'd have different genealogies if they were half brothers with different fathers, for instance. Fourth, there's also several plausible explanations for what seems like an error about when Jesus was born. So just to make sure you understand what's going on here, let me summarize it. The potential problem, of course, is that the Gospels say Jesus was born during the reign of Herod. And we know from many historical sources that Herod died in 4 BC. But Luke, the Gospel of Luke, seems to say Jesus was born during the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And some historians, as Pitts mentioned, including Josephus, say that Quirinius became governor of Syria and oversaw a census in 6 AD. Now, obviously, Jesus couldn't have been born before 4 BC and after 6 AD. So some here have concluded that Luke has made an error. But there's at least 4 plausible explanations for what's going on. And this material I'm about to give you comes from mostly this New Testament scholar, Darrell Bach, who earned his PhD at the well-known University of Aberdeen in Scotland. So first, it's plausible that this census began before 4 BC under another governor, but wasn't finished until Quirinius became governor in 6 AD. Obviously, a census takes a long time, even nowadays, but especially in the ancient world without technology. So if this is the case, then Luke is saying Jesus was born before 4 BC, and there's no contradiction. It's plausible Quirinius was merely the administrator of a census that took place before 4 BC, before he became governor in 6 AD. The Greek word here, hegemonio, sometimes translated as governor in English, was a general term in Greek used for any administrative position. So it's plausible Augustus entrusted the census to Quirinius even before he became governor. So if that's the case, then Luke is saying that Jesus was born before 4 BC, and there's no contradiction again. The third one, it's also plausible that Luke said the census took place before Quirinius was governor, not while he was governor. The Greek word here, protos, was used to mean first, but also sometimes used to mean before. And if that's how Luke was using it, then it shouldn't be translated this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, but instead should be translated this was the census taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria. And if that's the case, then Luke was saying Jesus was born during a prior census that took place before Quirinius. And again, there's no contradiction in that case. The last one then, it's plausible Quirinius was governor of Syria twice, once before 4 BC and then again after 6 AD. In fact, archaeologists have discovered an ancient Latin inscription discovered in 1764 AD, which may indicate that in fact he did serve as governor twice. And if he did, then there'd be no contradiction. Now remember, the gospel writer Luke has shown himself to be very historically reliable by giving dozens of instances of accurate historical information throughout his gospel in the book of Acts. So the way I look at it, it's similar to when you have a friend who's proven themselves reliable and trustworthy over time, but then a situation arises and it seems like they've made a mistake or lied. Well, because of your past experiences with her, you wouldn't immediately accuse her of making a mistake or lying. Instead, you'd assume there was a misunderstanding until you got more evidence either way. And I think Luke should be given the same benefit of the doubt based on his superb historical reliability. Almost done here. Just give me one more second. Let's say Luke did make a mistake about when Jesus was born. Of course, that would defeat my position that the Bible's completely correct in all details. But a position like C.S. Lewis's, which merely maintains the Bible's historically reliable about the major events, would simply conclude Luke made an honest mistake. Just like if my friend said the car she hit was black, but actually it was blue. She wasn't being deceptive, she just made an honest mistake. And just because somebody makes a mistake, it doesn't mean that they're trying to deceive. It might just be that, an honest mistake. I would say Pitts is making quite a speculative leap to conclude that if Luke is wrong here, that he's purposefully lying. I think Pitts again is guessing about the biblical author's motives and assuming they had deceptive motives because he's already presupposed they were making all this stuff up.
Okay, thank you, Adam. We will have Luke go ahead and start sharing his screen. Okay, and then Adam, you can stop sharing yours. Okay, it looks like we've transitioned, and I will hand the floor over to Luke Pitts for his third response.
Okay, thank you. So it should be clear, now that Adam is not going to be able to prove to you that the Bible is true, in so much that I am not going to be able to prove to you that the Bible contains invented stories. The question that's relevant to us is how much of a leap has to be made in order to explain the apparent issues raised by the skeptic. Okay, the question assumes the apologist has an explanation, but how good is that explanation? We can all come up with a million explanations for every issue raised by the skeptic, but are they reasonable explanations? Do they require a little leap or a big leap? So when Adam says that Mark mentions Jesus's family thinking he was crazy, um, and saying that we can assume he didn't mean Jesus's mother, this is kind of a big leap. And that's because Mark actually tells us who makes up this family who's coming to get him. Then Jesus's mother and brothers arrived. Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And why did they come to the crowded house? Are they there to listen to the one who was a law teaching child prodigy in the Jerusalem temple? The one about who an angel told Mary is the Son of God? The one who Mary knows she gave birth to as a virgin? No, she came to get him because she and her other sons think he is out of his mind. But I think we have even a bigger leap here, and it's that the Gospel of Luke mentions Jesus's father being from the line, Joseph being from the line of David. Okay, that's why the Holy Family must travel to Bethlehem. And Luke gives us the genealogy of Jesus, which goes from Joseph to David. But the apologist's claim in this genealogy is Luke is actually not talking about Joseph, Jesus's father. Think how wild of a proposition this would be if we only had the Gospel of Luke. We would have every reason to believe that the Joseph who is mentioned as coming from the line of David in chapter 2 is the same Joseph of the line of David in the genealogy in chapter 3. Saying otherwise, I think, really discredits the competence of the writer of the Gospel of Luke. Keep in mind, this is one of our most gifted New Testament writers who gave us the prodigal son. I think he would have recognized that he has two different Josephs from the line of David going on and would have helped us out with that. Let's keep this issue in context, though. Of all the religions that have holy bloodlines involved, only one of them actually has a true holy bloodline. Only one time in history did a bloodline actually matter. And in this one very special case, this very special bloodline is given to us by two sources, and we don't know why they don't match. Adam tells us he doesn't know why they don't match. He doesn't know if Luke's genealogy is Mary's father or Joseph's mother or Joseph's stepfather. Adam says that we should trust the writer of Luke because he's like a friend who's proven to be trustworthy over time, and then a questionable situation arises and you can trust him. But does this analogy fit our topic? With the birth stories, we're talking about the first things Luke and Matthew tell us. Why wouldn't we start there? And additionally, why would we bias ourselves to trust the writer of Luke when nearly all historians are telling us that this census did not happen? And when non-historians like us can clearly see that there are issues with the genealogy, the travels of the Holy Family, and Mary's understanding of Jesus. Catholic priest and renowned New Testament scholar Raymond E. Brown created controversy in the late 70s among fellow Catholics in a very conservative time when he said, there are formidable historical difficulties in every facet of Luke's description and dating of Quirinius' census, and most critical scholars recognize a confusion and misdating on Luke's part. Historians tell us that some details found in Acts in regards to place names, titles of officials, and temple rules do appear to be accurate, as Adam mentioned. Unlike the question of the census, where only fundamentalist Christian historians believe it actually occurred, the question of whether Acts is historically reliable is an active debate among New Testament scholars. There's certainly some historically valuable information in Acts as well as Luke. But is it all accurate? Did the Holy Spirit kill Christians for not giving all of their money to the early church? Is that part accurate? All right, change gears here. We're gonna get out of the. Everyone's probably sick of that discussion. And so one of the most intriguing and one I would be reticent to mention as a skeptic, of course, is the story of Noah's flood, and we mentioned it earlier. But I just want to say, apologetic website Answers in Genesis, they did the math, and they figured out that the flood happened in 2348 BC. Okay, but we have to ask, even if we look at the entire third millennium from 3000 to 2000 BC, when was the population of the world 8 people? The Egyptians invented hieroglyphs and built their biggest pyramids well before 2348 BC, and they were certainly active after that date. Who from the descendants of Noah learned hieroglyphs and started building pyramids again? The oldest, as mentioned, the oldest extant copy of the flood story is from Babylon. It's written on a clay tablet from around 1650 BC in Akkadian. It's the tablet 3 of the Astrahasis epic. Astrahasis is warned by one benevolent god Enki to build a giant boat for his family and animals in order to survive a flood brought on by the other gods who are fed up with humanity. And what's the oldest extant copy of Noah's flood that we have today that we can touch? The Dead Sea Scrolls from 150 BC. This is 1,500 years later. Are we to believe that the story of the flood in Noah is in fact older than the Astrahasis epic, and that Astrahasis actually in fact ripped off Noah? There happens to be 3 minor variations of Noah's flood in the Dead Sea Scrolls concerning when Noah offers up a sacrifice to God. It's not really a big deal. But when pressed about these variants, the co-curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls display in Jerusalem, Dr. Adolfo Reutmann, an ordained conservative rabbi, had an interesting answer. He said, the whole of the story of Noah is imaginary. The flood is connected to various traditions which date back to ancient times. Our Noah is just a later version of the characters we know about from earlier times. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. That would conclude then the third round of back and forth. And we have one more round left, so I will start that now. But before we do, first, let's have Adam share your screen. Okay, so like I said, we have one more round left. This round will be 5 minutes apiece. So a final reminder that pretty soon, about in 10 minutes, we'll be getting to the questions. So Facebook, YouTube, Zoom, you can submit your questions to us, and we will ask them after this last round is over. So let's see. Luke, you can stop sharing now. Okay, we have transitions. So I will hand it over to Adam for your concluding speech.
All right. Thanks, guys. Well, tonight I described 3 positions here up on the screen. Some people, including myself, believe the Bible is true in the sense it's completely correct in all details. And in my second speech, I presented an argument for this. Some people, like C.S. Lewis, Bruce Metzger, they don't believe the Bible is completely correct in every detail, but they believe it's true in the sense it's historically reliable about the major events, Jesus' message, the miracles, particularly his resurrection. In my first speech, I presented historical evidence for these things. Now, Christians who hold this position may affirm, for example, that Luke made an honest mistake about the exact year Jesus was born. These Christians may also, like Augustine from the 4th century and C.S. Lewis, might hold that some of these Old Testament stories, like the Garden of Eden or Noah's flood, shouldn't be interpreted literally, but are more like parables which teach important truths. Now, I respectfully disagree with that position, but many Christians hold that position. The third position tonight, obviously, is that some people, including Pitts, don't believe that the Bible is true in either sense. Now, I do agree with Pitts that I'm not able to prove that the Bible is true. But what I mean by that is that I, nor any other finite human being, could ever prove something with absolute certainty. The only way that we could know something was true with absolute certainty is if we were omniscient, and we're not. Since we're not omniscient, every time we choose to believe something is true, there's always some uncertainty. That's why there's always an element of trust. We can call it faith, if you will, in every decision we make, every belief we have. Even our scientific beliefs have an element of faith because we can't prove anything with absolute certainty. But here, this is important. Don't think of faith as the uncertainty in a belief. For example, when you choose to trust your mechanic, let's say Bob, if you're 60% confident that he's trustworthy because of good reasons and evidence, don't think of the remaining 40% uncertainty as faith. That's thinking of faith and reason as opposites, as enemies. But it doesn't make sense to think of faith that way because, let's say, again, hypothetically, you're 99% confident because of good reasons and evidence that another mechanic, Sally, is trustworthy. Well, if you think of that 1% uncertainty as faith, you'd say that you have more faith in Bob than you do in Sally, that you trust him more. But that's not right. No, based on good reasons and evidence, you're 99% confident Sally is trustworthy and only 60% confident about Bob. Faith is just trusting something or someone based on good reasons and evidence. So the more reasons and evidence you have, the stronger your faith or trust is. And all of our beliefs work this way, including belief in Christianity. I've chosen to believe Christianity is true because of all the good reasons and evidence for it, some of which I presented tonight. And as I learn more reasons and evidence for it, my faith or trust, if you will, grows. Though we can't prove Christianity is true with absolute certainty, that's not unique to Christianity. There's nothing we can prove with absolute certainty. So believing in Christianity, like all other beliefs, should be based on good reasons and evidence. Now, lastly, what should we trust Jesus for? We trust our mechanic Sally to fix our car, so what do we trust Jesus to do for us? Well, according to Christianity, we were created to enjoy personal, loving relationships, both with God and with other humans. And one way we're supposed to express our love for God is by following his instructions for how to have the best loving relationships possible. Unfortunately, we've all disobeyed these instructions, and that's why our relationship with God is broken. And if we continue in this state, according to Christianity, we'll be separated relationally from God forever. What Jesus claimed to do is not be able to fix our car, but to fix our relationship with God by living the perfect, loving life that we've all failed to live, and by dying on the cross to pay the punishment we deserve for our unloving disobedience. So Jesus asks us to trust him, not to fix our car, but to fix our relationship with God. He promised that anyone who trusted him would be forgiven and restored back to a right relationship with God to enjoy loving relationships with him and others forever. Thankfully, he's given us many good reasons and evidence to trust him.
Okay, thank you, Adam. And now I will make the last transition of the night. So Luke, begin sharing your screen. And while he's doing that, I will just take this opportunity to mention that you want to submit your questions. We've been getting a few here right now, but keep submitting them, and we will get to them in a moment after Luke gives his concluding remarks. Okay, it looks like we're good. So Adam, you can stop sharing your screen. Here we are. And Luke, your concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you. Adam says that we're to follow God's instructions. It's what he created us to do. But these errors and inconsistencies found in the Bible often contribute to confusion about what the Bible's instructions actually are. It's one of the reasons there are so many different Christian denominations and so many books on how to interpret the Bible. Here's one example we're all aware of. Should we execute people for the sin of loving someone of the same sex? The Old Testament says, yes, we should drop stones on them until they die. This is in Leviticus. But are we to still observe the Old Testament law? Matthew says, yes. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Well, maybe we can go to Paul. Paul seemed to indicate, no, we shouldn't keep following the Old Testament law, right? But he says homosexuals are deserving of death anyway. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. This is Romans 1:32. So what about Jesus? Those without sin should cast the first stone. Well, we know he didn't say that. So we don't really know what Jesus thought on this matter. He didn't address it. And so this has led to the odd modern circumstance of having both preachers that preach death to gays and gay preachers. And maybe some of them are the same sometimes. Good cover story. The very least we can say is that there's an inconsistent biblical message here. Adam's mentioned the C.S. Lewis style Christian a number of times, and Adam and I disagree with this perspective, and here's one reason why. In 2010, well-known evangelical scholar Mike Licona sent shockwaves through the evangelical world by claiming that the account of the dead holy people coming out of their tombs and walking around Jerusalem when Jesus was resurrected, this is only reported in the Gospel of Matthew. He said it probably was not historical, but poetical, a legend, an embellishment, and literary special effects. His former evangelical friends said, hey, Mike, if some or all of the phenomena reported at Jesus' death are poetic devices, we may rightly ask whether Jesus' resurrection is not more of the same. And yes, indeed, we can. If there are issues even in the major events, why should we just have faith that they're historical as well? Why would Jesus inspire a lukewarm, half-truth Bible? And most importantly, why wouldn't we then forgive the apparent untruths found in, say, the Quran or the Vedas or the Book of Mormon or L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, for which there are many? And Licona points out just one of the difficulties in the resurrection of Jesus. They certainly all can't be explained by the different perspectives of eyewitnesses. There are issues among the Gospels with respect to the men who were crucified with Jesus, Jesus's last words, who came to the empty tomb, who they met when they got there, if the tomb was open or closed, or where they were told to meet Jesus. Many of these require harmonizations that merge inconsistent messages. Was Jesus in confusion and anguish in his death, as in Mark and Matthew, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or is he calm and certain, as in Luke? Today you will be with me in paradise. We all need hope, but this is my power out. You can maintain hope and justice without having to believe that God once ordered the execution of homosexuals. You can maintain hope in the future without believing that Jesus will return in your lifetime. You can maintain hope and understanding without knowing where the earth came from. And you can maintain hope and spirituality without believing the Bible is true. It's my hope that you won't be afraid to look deeply into these issues of the Bible with a fiercely unbiased and humble mind. Thank you.